So welcome to another session of Speak Your Mind by Mobilize. And my guest this time is Gaelle Eizlini. Gaelle, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your taking the time from your schedule to share your thoughts with us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ian. I'm super excited to be working with Mobilize. I think that this initiative is fantastic. I'm honored to be among so many incredible speakers. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. We've known each other for a while. We've had a chance to speak. So I'm really glad that you're going to be with us, sharing with more people some of the stuff that we also get to talk about. So in this panel, Gaelle is going to be addressing the topic of why has declaring climate emergencies failed to create meaningful change? And Gaelle, if it's okay, I'd like to actually open with a question.
Sure.
And that question is quite simple. What, in your opinion, is missing in how we address climate emergencies?
I think one of the biggest things that I see that's missing is sort of the lack of a tie back to what I consider to be the cause of climate change. We talk a lot about the symptoms of climate change. We talk about the emissions, and we talk about carbon, and we talk about methane, and we talk about waste, but we don't really discuss what's driving that. We don't really discuss the economic drivers of why there are emissions. And I think that a big part of that is that I see in a number of different areas is that we're not addressing our sort of growth economic models. That to me is a huge driver, because even something that seems very small, like 3% growth, actually doubles the size of an economy over about 25 years. So we're consistently, making more. And I think that as long as that becomes sort of our primary mindset, it's very, very difficult for us to be reducing emissions and reducing waste when our economic model talks about growth. The other thing that I see is that growth is really so embedded that no matter what the ideology is, no matter what the political party is, for the most part, economic platforms are based on growth. The Chinese government looks to grow. The British Prime Minister, Liz Truss, famously, when she became Prime Minister, her platform was growth, growth, growth. In Europe, on the left and on the right, economic platforms discuss growth. And so I think if we don't acknowledge that economic growth is the driver of growing emissions, then it's very, very difficult for us to put in meaningful efforts to reduce those emissions. I think we've also seen from a policy perspective that support for economic growth means that many policymakers have taken sort of a back seat to business and industry, right? Most of our levers are still based on voluntary targets. They're still based on market solutions, right? Carbon markets, all of these different aspects that are still tied very much into a growth paradigm. And so as long as we're still in that growth paradigm, and as long as, excuse me, much of our levers, many of our instruments are still voluntary, it's going to be very, very difficult to reduce emissions overall and to meaningfully address that aspect of climate change, right? I think that that's a huge aspect. I would also say that part of it is sort of this systemic, which sort of ties into one of the other questions that Mobilize is having, and that other speakers are talking about, is that as we address the symptoms, we're not addressing the causes. And if we're not addressing the cause, we're not acknowledging where in our systems we are actually continually looking to increase activity, which increases emissions, which increases waste. And I think part of that is a business model where the natural world is an external factor. We're not really embedded. We're not part of an intimate relationship with nature. We consider trees to be lumber. We look at, water systems and we dam them, we control them. But in a lot of cases, we don't understand fundamentally some of the important aspects of a natural system. And I think that's a huge aspect of it.
So you've mentioned obviously the systemic element of it and this emphasis on this ongoing growth and then the separation of humanity with the wider environment and our continual effort to control, to manage, to leverage, to take advantage of it. So that's how we are interacting with the system. What do you think is missing then from how we interact with the system? That's what we are doing, but what's missing from what we're doing? Or maybe, what are we not seeing in the system? Or what do we need to do to make it work? Do we need to take something out? Is there something that's missing that needs to go into it? How do we start addressing this lack of balance?
I think part of it is cultural. I think that there's a great deal of fear involved. I think that there's an enormous amount of change that we have to do societally. And I don't think that that's being addressed by our political leaders or our business leaders. Right. And I think that the scale of the change that's required brings in a great deal of fear on a number of different levels. And we're still seeing a sort of siloed approach. We still talk about business, policy, and sort of citizens, consumer, and each side blames the other. Consumers blame industry and government for lack of policy. Policymakers blame consumers and industry for pursuing, and behaviors that are sort of counterproductive. And business complains that too much policy is anathema to their success. So I think that it's an unwillingness to a certain point to address that deep cultural shift that's necessary. And I believe that part of that is also sort of a fear of what that change looks like. We're still very much caught in these sort of paradigms of lack, these paradigms of sort of game theory of, what you win, I lose. And I think that, a big part of that is being able to come together. All three different aspects of our sort of cultural systems to understand that we all have obligations in this system. We all have obligations to care for each other. We all have obligations to care for the planet. We all have obligations to, consider how we interact. But I also think that part of it is, again, back to growth, is that we're always looking for more. And so we don't have a culture that's based on sufficiency. And we don't see those examples even in our day-to-day, TV viewing, film, books. A lot of our cultural aspects sort of continue to feed us this idea that change is to be feared. And so I think that leads us to sort of a lack of imagination, right? Our leaders are fearful of imagining a new system. Our business leaders are fearful of breaking from the pack and creating new business models. Our consumers are fearful that they're going to lose out. Our citizens are fearful that, they won't be able to, support their families and live their lives. And so and it's a difficult thing, right? It's such a huge amount of change that being able to communicate that we can do it, that we can come together and that we can collaborate globally, and especially locally is something that's missing. And so for me, I think that's a huge one, is being able to sort of shift how we communicate with each other, that we can do this, right? If we can go from a 12-second flight to the moon in about 60 years, human beings are incredibly resilient and incredibly innovative, and even incredibly innovative outside of a business paradigm, right? Some of our most impressive changes haven't necessarily come because of a business need, but a societal need. And I think that those are things that really need to be addressed. And And I do think that policymakers are probably the best place to sort of saying, we can do this, right? We got out of a huge pandemic, and yes, it was frightening, and yes, there are still questions, but for the most part, our societies were very cohesive, and we did understand that it was important to work together. So I do think we do have the tools. I think it's a question also of using them and not being afraid to use them.
So you keep coming back to this issue of fear or panic. So, okay, so how do we communicate in a way, or how do we communicate this need for change without creating that panic, or in a way that resolves that panic? Other speakers who've addressed this have said that that it needs to begin with presenting a more positive, something that's based on hope, something that's based on a vision for something that's better, and that's how you mobilize people. But like you said, for example, with the epidemic, with Corona, with that whole time period, it was based very much on panic and managing fear, managing the unknown. Well, here we're entering the unknown. So how do we resolve this then to bridge that gap?
I think we look to encourage how we can be realistic and honest without being fearful. I think that we need to start having conversations in the mass media around what is working. There are incredible and there are real world, real-time examples of regenerative practices, happening incredibly quickly in a natural environment that seems to be on the brink of collapse. Bringing out those stories, I think, is super important. Bringing out that kind of knowledge to inspire young people to move into those fields. I think even culturally, right? Looking at stories that are not dystopian, right? Looking at our future as something to be energetic about. I know for myself, when I'm, overwhelmed by stories of climate collapse, I find that really distorts my own energy and my own willingness to participate and collaborate, because you think, well, this is terrible, and we're all about to collapse. So there's a sort of instinct to retreat. But there are so many examples of, positive interactions of both technology and the natural world that I think are out there. I think there are new paradigms that start to discuss sufficiency and start to look at maybe a consumerist worldview doesn't feed our souls. So how do we start bringing that into our day-to-day culture? How do we get away from the got nothing to do, let's go shopping idea, And so I think that there are those examples out there. I think it's a question of finding them and amplifying them. And that's where personally I find that I'm the most interested in getting together, right? There are people out there who are working with startups, and how do you maintain a positive worldview, and how do you maintain your purpose while you're trying to get your startup going? How do we consider that business wasn't always based about growth, that trade wasn't always based about growth? How are we learning from each other, and how are we looking to sort of interact as a local community, a regional community, a global community that isn't sort of based on bottom lines? And so I think that being able to highlight those examples that are not about fear, but are about positive engagement, about inspiring a community to work, about looking at how we can, put pressure on companies. But I think a lot of companies are also interested in sort of long-term longevity. And so maybe they are interested in those shifts. Maybe there's simply a question of bringing that to their attention as often as we can. And so I am really hopeful that there are many aspects, but I do think that it will take, at some level, some political and policy leadership to get us there, to say we can do it, we can get out of this. I think the biggest example too is look at the ozone layer and treaties around CFCs. Part of that was hard targets. We are not letting this substance out, right? And understanding where there were economies that perhaps needed some more support. And I think that's part of it as well, is being able to sort of speak some sorts of truth and say that, yes, we have hard targets. This is not about ending your experience or your particular lifestyle, but it's about a shift that you can make, that we can all make together, and that leads us to a positive outcome in a real world, real time scenario.
Yeah, it's interesting. You touched on a number of different dynamics. You touched on the scale and scope, meaning you'd referenced communities, coming together at the community level to start mobilizing around a vision. So you started talking also about the emotional side of about it being something positive and not just fear, but something that you also touched on that I liked, and you referenced it with obviously the Montreal Protocol and the CFCs, said in 1987, I think. Is that was effective within a lifetime, within a generation. And so you start talking about the time scale. When we talk about politics, typically a term is 4 years, right?
Yeah.
And there's always this blaming of politicians. Well, they don't care because they can just kick it down the road. Well, there's nowhere left really to kick it down the road. We're pretty much at the end line. And then you had talked about regeneration. And I bring it all together because I think, okay, it's interesting because you have a season, you have a growing season. Within days/weeks, you see the flower, bloom, and it goes through its cycle, meaning it's something that everyone can relate to. And maybe it's addressing the fear needs to be done in a way that connects it to time, that this isn't 50 years down the road, it's within your lifetime, but it doesn't have to be bad. In the same way that you can see a flower bloom and regenerate and regrow the following season, we can do the same thing here. And the Montreal Protocol is an example of that with the CFCs, where within, okay, it took a number of years, but it has clearly been effective from from what
and
the science,
and it was
and that's
science-based.
positive. Yeah.
Right. It was based on scientific evidence. And I think that that's exactly it. And I think we can build these micro habits, right? There's this sort of new phenomenon of, if you want to do some big personal change, you just start with little changes at a time and those layer up. And I think it's the same thing here, right? We need to start looking at how we can get producers to reduce individual plastic wrapping, right? I go to my supermarket, and how many, products, snacks for kids are all individually wrapped? Well, how do we start scaling that back? Just this month here in Canada, we've had sort of single-use plastic ban. And so that's, looking at how that's going to change. And so while some of those are effective, people tend to fear that, oh, well, how am I going to lose? Well, I can still buy certain products, snacks for my son, that I am now responsible for packaging separately, as opposed to having all of this sort of extra waste. And I think that as we add those little micro habits and micro policies, we really can overcome quite a bit. But it's going to take that political will, and it's going to take that systemic view of how we address this.
It reminds me, of that poster that everyone has at some time or another, or they've seen somewhere or another. The longest journey starts with that first step. But in this case, yes, it's the first step, but it's also knowing where that journey is going to take us.
Yeah.
But also to create the optimism, it needs to take place. So there needs to be a sense that we can make a significant contribution in a time scale that we can relate to. That goes,
and I think
not just beyond us. It's not in, at the end of the century. It needs to be
and I think part of it is looking at our children. What can we do in our children's lifetime, right? What are the habits that I can implement now? What are the kinds of policies that can be implemented now that will have a real world effect on my son's life, a positive effect on my son's life, and your children's life.
See together with them at the same time, so we experience it together. So well, so Inez, as we Gaelle, as we come to the end, if there would be one thought or takeaway that you would like to leave with the audience, what would that be?
For me, it's that, we can figure this out. I think part of it is sort of coming to this cultural shift that we can have our cake and eat it too. I think we've shown for the last few decades that we cannot have our cake and eat it too. That doesn't mean that we can't have cake and then eat it later. I think that that's going to be a huge cultural shift that needs to be examined. And I think part of it is looking at sort of the elasticity of human culture. We can shift, we can And it's not always based on catastrophe, right? I think that this is something that's very important, is sort of looking at, what do we want to build? How do we want to build it? Who can I build it with? As opposed to, how do I keep my own family and my own self alive? And I think that that's going to be a huge shift. And I think that that was one of the, in a way, positive shifts around COVID, was that we sort of all learned to take care of each other. I know that there's been a lot of polarization around that, but I think we can look at those positive examples of understanding, you know, what did we do well, and how did we communicate that well? And I think potentially focusing on the people who were willing to participate, focus on the people who were willing to contribute, as opposed to worrying about the people who are going to complain and are very fearful, and helping those people, especially who are fearful, understand, we're not telling you to lock yourself in a basement. We're not telling you that the world is going to collapse. We're saying that if we all do this together, we can manage it. Our worlds didn't change significantly when the Montreal Protocol was enacted. You know, CFC, that changed at an industrial level, certainly, but I don't think my life was any less than because I wasn't able to use CFCs. And so I think that we need to have those positive trade-offs as part of the conversation. Right?
It's interesting that you know, that was a technological solution, but it was a technological solution that still took place within that same system of growth, right?
Yeah.
Now we're talking, and maybe in this way I'm kind of closing the loop, right?
Yeah.
To what you talked about in the very beginning. The question now is that viable, or is there no choice but to reevaluate this growth first paradigm to something that's based more on sufficiency, which doesn't have to be austerity, by the way.
Exactly.
As I'm sure, which is basically what you're saying as well. So very interesting.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that, to me, is based on real policy choices, right? And policymakers have to be able to put a line in the sand and say, you know what, we require hard targets. We require clear action. You know, because if we keep waiting for things to happen, right, the loss and damage fund was announced at COP27, and they're still bickering over how it's going to be funded. So, you know, and certainly that's important, but I think that at some point there have to be really clear decisions made at some of those macro levels. But that macro level, I don't think is something that necessarily restricts micro action. And I think that too often that is that sort of trade-off. It's that, well, I'm going to lose and I won't be able to get the things I want, and I won't be able to do the things I want because of these policies. And that's not always the case, right? I think it's a question of finding that balance, which isn't always very easy, but I think we can do it.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier also, you know, instead of trying to fight with everyone who doesn't agree, you try and cooperate with those who are aligned with how you see it. The question is whether that can also happen at the policy level within the government, where there's, you know, these additional layers of interests that come to play, where even if at the individual level they might agree, they need to follow party lines or some kind of policy line that prevents them from doing it. A lot to think about there. So Gaelle, this has been really interesting. I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk about this. I hope it's also been interesting to our audience. So, you know, there's so much to do in the coming year, and I'm looking forward to hopefully being able to tackle at least some of this stuff together with you and some of our other speakers as well. There are a lot of us who are aligned, I think. So
absolutely. Well, I'm very appreciative. I think that Climb Mobilize is a great initiative. Again, I think that there's so many people who are really willing and active in this space, and to see so many people coming together is again really inspiring, right? And so I think that more of this kind of initiative is exactly what's going to help us turn this around. So thank you for taking the initiative.
No, thank you, and I really do appreciate it that you joined us. And this is just the first. We plan to have more of these events where we bring people together like this, that they can speak their mind about these different topics that don't necessarily get the kind of exposure that they need to get. So thanks again, and looking forward to keeping to work. continuing to push forward together with you.
Absolutely. I'm super excited to be a part of this. Thanks again, Ian.
Thank you.